Hello and welcome to one of the first editions of Law Stories. I'm Linda Thompson.
And I'm Megan Talbot. And because this is one of the first editions, we figured we'd tell you what this podcast is about. Law Stories is aimed at talking about the law from a perspective you might not have heard before. Law is often thought of as this mysterious discipline considered only by academics and learned professionals. There's a lot of mystique about law. There's a lot of feeling like it's not for everyone. It's only for a select few who have been inducted into the secrets. We don't feel like this is the case. We feel like laws are a thing which affects everyone, which is involved in almost every aspect of your lives. And it's this really interesting and unfortunately sometimes invisible world which affects almost everything we do.
Yeah.
So we thought we'd bring you this podcast to show you the really fascinating aspects of the law that are not secret, they're not mysterious, and they're super interesting.
But they're understandable to everybody. So one of the first things that we thought that we may, bring to everybody's attention, I guess, is that, the UK have recently had a referendum. And as part of that, we decided that we were no longer going to be part of the EU. From my experiences, when I've been looking at the news and trying to get my head around all of this, Wales hasn't really featured very much in all of these discussions. And as a result, we both live in Wales, and, Wales is very important, as far as we're concerned, to the United Kingdom. So I think we should have some sort of idea about where Wales is going and where our future is going within Wales as part of being independent and away from Europe.
Yeah, and of course Wales is interesting because the reason it's interesting hasn't been in the news when we've been talking about the referendum. And it's particularly interesting because of devolution.
Yeah. So as a result of this, devolution is basically the passing down of powers. So, Westminster in London provide most of the laws, etc., for the United Kingdom, or for England in particular. And for Wales, however, Wales do also have powers that they can then govern their own governments. So as part of Welsh devolution, which is increasingly, I suppose Wales have increasingly gained additional powers throughout, the past 20 years, I suppose. And through this, it means that we have governed ourselves more and more and more. So we have some powers. That Westminster don't necessarily dictate to us. And now that we are no longer part of the EU, Wales then also, like England, can create some of their own laws, can create some of their own positions.
And I think that's something people don't think about enough, is that the role that the EU played in our law. And the EU had a big role in filling a lot of gaps which we don't fill in our own domestic law. And so when we leave the EU, the question's going to be, how do we fill the gap? And that's where devolution comes in, because for Wales and other devolved jurisdictions like Scotland, there's going to be the question of, how does the devolved jurisdiction, Wales or Scotland, fill that gap? And how do we deal with the things that the EU used to deal with? And that's going to be different from the rest of the UK.
Yep.
So it's this really interesting dynamic where we have to deal with some extra things that, say, England doesn't, because of how we are governed.
Yeah. So as part of this, I spoke and had an interview with Sir Paul Silk.
Well, I was interested in Welsh devolution, really, from a very early age. I remember giving evidence to a parliamentary committee, and they looked at me very askance when I said that when I was in school I bought a copy of the Kilbrandon Commission report, which is true. So I'm a bit of a geek about these things. I was born and brought up in Wales, and I was interested in law and constitutional matters from an early age. I didn't actually study law at university, although I might have done, and I went to work in the House of Commons as a House of Commons clerk. Those are the people who, the most senior of them sit in front of the Speaker's chair looking like lawyers, but they're not. And I did various work in Parliament, and really rather hoped that there would be Welsh devolution in 1979 when there wasn't. And then in 1997, when there was, and there was an opportunity to come and work in the National Assembly. I went for it, and I became Clerk of the National Assembly in 2001. I spent about 6 years in the National Assembly, then I went back to Parliament, and I was then asked to chair the Commission on Devolution in Wales, which I did between 2011 and 2014. So I've been interested in devolution all along. Some of the parts of my career I've only had I haven't had a professional involvement in it, but for parts of my career, certainly when I was down in Cardiff as the Clerk of the National Assembly and the 3 years I was chair of the Commission on Devolution, then it was my bread and butter as well.
So, in light of Brexit, we asked Sir Paul Silk what the future was for devolution within Wales.
Particularly in light of a possible bid for Scottish independence and the other problems that may be caused with devolved jurisdictions due to leaving the EU.
Do you think now, with Scotland looking for another referendum, that if they do leave the UK, that it might, entice Wales maybe to follow suit?
I think that there's some really interesting consequences of Brexit, and in both in Scotland and Northern Ireland. I've got no more of a crystal ball than anyone else, but I can see that there may well be another referendum in Scotland. That referendum may vote in favour of independence for Scotland. I think that's still touch and go. I think in Ireland, the Brexit result is really difficult for the Republic of Ireland, and will be difficult for Northern Ireland as well. And one could see some fragility in the Union because of the Brexit result, both in the case of Scotland and in Northern Ireland. Well, of course, in Wales we voted to leave the European Union. So I think some of us thought beforehand that the result might be that Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland would all vote to remain, and England would vote to leave, or England other than London would vote to leave. But we're not in that position now. We're in a position where Wales has voted to leave, not by as big a majority as parts of England, but still by a substantial majority. So what does that mean if Scotland and Northern Ireland in the future peel off from the United Kingdom in some way for Wales? Well, it'd be very strange, I think, to have... It's strange already in asymmetrical union with one very large nation and three smaller nations. It would be even stranger if we had England and Wales. And I'm not sure, I've said this in another context some time ago, that I'm not sure whether the consequence might not be more joining together rather than more separation between England and Wales.
With all these things being devolved and these powers given to Wales, the question sort of comes up, because we get so much funding from the EU, how is Wales going to fund all of these things that it's going to be responsible for that it wasn't responsible for before?
How do you think Brexit will affect Wales and Welsh devolution, particularly when Wales received an annual benefit, 245 million, as a member of the EU? Well,
because I come from belief in Remain was right, then I think it'll be adversely affected inside Wales. Let's take agriculture, upland agriculture, livestock farming, sheep farming, is heavily supported by European money. If that becomes the responsibility of the Welsh Government, during the referendum campaign, George Eustace said that the farming minister in England said, we will replace all that money. Well, George Eustace could say that on behalf of England, and that may or may not be the case. But I don't myself believe that necessarily the Welsh Government, short of money, and dominated by urban Wales, which is where the majority of the voters for the Welsh Government come from, will see the support of agriculture as important as some of the other things that you'll have to support, like education and housing and health. So I think that's one area that will potentially suffer. I think we're talking in the university, and I think universities are another area that potentially will suffer from research projects which are co-funded by governments in the UK and European Union. And we've heard from people like the First Minister about the fact that they are going to postpone until the autumn decisions about funding all sorts of things because they're not sure where things are going, how things are going to turn out, or what money is going to come from London. We've got a new Prime Minister in London. She's not been somebody who has, as far as I'm aware, been particularly involved in devolution matters in the past. She may have a different view of all sorts of things, like the funding of Wales and Scotland. She may have different views of the Barnett formula. So I think we're in a very uncertain time. The removal of the European Union funding, well, it may be replaced, and I think we are in the position we now are in. We are leaving the European Union. I think we all have to hope that everything is going to work out well, and different sources of funding are going to be found, and we're going to be successful in a wider world. I didn't believe that before, but I sincerely hope that is what the result is now.
Because Brexit took us by surprise, I wanted to find out whether there was anything that he would consider differently, and whether the new recommendations may have been made in light of Brexit. I believe under the recommendations of the Silk Commission Part 2, it was stated that Wales should receive more powers in relation to energy and transport, which sadly is heavily dependent on EU funding. Do you think this is still a suitable solution for Wales?
Well, I don't think that we made those recommendations on the basis of who is the source of the funding. Well, we didn't make those recommendations on the basis of who is the source of the funding. Our recommendations were, we tried to judge them against a set of principles and therefore decide where powers on particular matters should rest. And the recommendations we made in energy and transport were as a result of following our principles. Transport, the development of the metro, for example, the South Wales Metro, infrastructure development, roads development, that's all going to be more difficult in after the removal of EU funding, of course. But I don't think that would alter the view we had that what we recommended and what the Wales Bill is going to enact has been further devolution of powers in energy and transport. I don't think we'd have made any different recommendations than we did now if we'd predicted that the UK was going to leave the EU.
But we know, because it's already happened, that in the process of Brexit, the Supreme Court is already involved, perhaps in a way that it hasn't been involved before. So we asked him about the future of the Supreme Court and how the court's role may change with relation to devolution and the future after Brexit.
How does it fit within a Welsh legal system, fit within a federal system? I can see that the eventual destination is going to be something much more similar to the position of Scotland and Northern Ireland, going back to what we were saying before, assuming that they are still inside the United Kingdom, with the Supreme Court taking on more of that role of a constitutional court. But look, I'm not a lawyer, and I'm talking to a lawyer, I think there is a resistance among some of our judiciary to get involved in constitutional questions in a way in which constitutional courts in other countries, that's their job. So the constitutional court in Germany will be interpreting the constitution all the time. The constitutional court in Austria overturned the most recent presidential election in Austria. Now, would the Supreme Court ever, really interesting question just now, which I know is being argued by constitutional lawyers, would the Supreme Court ever say, oh no, it's not an issue of, it's not an exercise of the royal prerogative to invoke Article 50 to leave the European Union. That's a matter which must be determined by Parliament. Well, that question I think might come to them, but I'd be quite surprised if they thought it was something that they ought to decide, because our judges have not been as keen to get involved in some of these constitutional issues as judges in other countries have been. But perhaps that's a destination that we will be getting to, and the adjudication between different parts of the kingdom, the country, the United Kingdom, might be something that the courts do. We made a sort of gentle recommendation in this direction in our second report that didn't really get picked up very much, that if there are disputes between the UK government and the Welsh government, then they should be arbitrated at a sort of judicial level rather than not arbitrated at all. And that's exactly the sort of thing a constitutional court would do in the United States between what a state and what the federal government's powers and responsibilities are.
So if things look so doom and gloom, why did Wales and the UK vote to leave Europe? Why do you think the majority of Wales voted in favour of Brexit?
I spent most of my life as a public official, so was barred from doing any campaigning of any sort when I was doing that. The last campaigning I did was in the 1975 referendum, before I started work in the House of Commons. But I'm free now, and so I did some campaigning in this referendum for Remain. And what became very clear to me was that I was campaigning in the part of Wales that I live, which is the south part of Breconshire, south part of Powys. Not the poorest part of Wales in any sense, but there are poor parts of the towns and villages in South Powys, places like Brecon, Talabont, Llanganida. And what was quite clear to me as I went round there was that there were people who had not shared at all in prosperity, who felt excluded from all of that, and I think they wanted to give the people who they saw in some way responsible for that a bit of a kicking. And I think they thought the European Union was part of that, the government was part of that, the government in London was part of that, and I think that some of those votes were the votes of the excluded against the elite. And, I readily admit that I would be categorized as part of the elite in that context. So I think it was a sobering result, and it was particularly sobering when you look at places like Ystrad or Blaen y Gwent, Merthyr Tydfil, where people really don't feel that they've benefited at all from the prosperity that they see in other parts of the country, and I would attribute quite a lot of the Leave vote to that.
So with all of this in mind, of the problems funding things and the possible problems of the United Kingdom becoming increasingly less united, we sort of had to ask, would things have been different if devolution had been done differently? Would the kingdom be perhaps more united if we'd taken a different path?
Would the United Kingdom have been more united if we had a symmetric system of devolution? And that would, I'm imagining this would have involved devolution inside the regions of England, so we would have something more akin to a set of states. So Scotland would be a state, Northern Ireland would be a state, the north of England would be a state, Devon and Cornwall would be a state. That sort of idea. Would that have resulted in a greater feeling of unity inside the country? I'm not sure. It might have been neater, it might have been, obviously been more symmetric, but the other very asymmetric state is, of course, Spain, and there are tensions inside Spain between Catalonia and other parts of Spain that want independence, and of course there's a great disparity between the powers of the different regions of Spain, and it's not a particularly, I'm no expert in Spain, but it's not a particularly happily united country. I'm not sure I've got an answer to that,
And with all these changes, with Brexit, one of the main questions that I wanted to personally ask Sir Paul was what the end point was for devolution and what the differences were then between devolution and possible independence. What do you see as the end goal for devolution?
Well, is it a continual revolution? Is it always going to carry on wanting a step more? Now, somebody like David Davis, the MP for Monmouth, he talks about almost a ratchet. Every time you get a bit more devolution, you want a bit more. And that's, in his view, a slippery slope towards independence. I think that what we hoped we did in the Commission's report was to try to set out a set of principles which would guide where you can logically stop devolution and remain inside a United Kingdom. So we were not talking about going to independence. Now, if you're in Plaid Cymru and you support independence, then obviously you want to carry on going in this process all the way until you're a fully independent nation. Devolution is different from that. Devolution is maybe some more steps towards independence, but it says you stop at some point. And you stop, in our view, on the basis of some clearly articulated principles. Now, there's always going to be something on each side of that line that people are going to dispute about. We recommended the devolution of policing, for example. And the UK government has said that they believe that policing should not be devolved for a number of reasons, which they argue very cogently. Well, we didn't agree with those reasons, but that's a matter of dispute. But because it is a matter of dispute, it will carry on being a matter of dispute in the future. And the pressure for the devolution of policing, I don't think, is going to go away. And I can see that it is difficult to decide what at the margin is devolved and what isn't devolved. And that always gets confused as well by people's perception of the success with which devolved services are operating in any case. So people get mixed up in their minds questions of principle. This should be devolved because this is the right level at which it should be exercised. And, well, this shouldn't be devolved because it isn't being exercised very well at present. And those things get rather mixed up in people's minds, so they argue against devolution because of the perception that the Welsh Government isn't doing education or health or whatever it may be as well as they think that it could be done. But I think we tried to articulate some principles. We tried to say that any area should be judged against those principles, and there would always be difficulties at the margin, but that would enable a coherent system of devolution to be evolved. So, for example, we didn't suggest that the coinage should be devolved. That is something that's reserved under the government, under the Wales bill present before Parliament. Well, that's entirely logical in a devolution system. You don't want to have different coins circulating in Wales, or different weights and measures, or all sorts of things that are properly reserved to the UK government foreign policy. Then you get some difficult areas, like to what extent is social security policy something that or what could be broadly seen as social security policy be something that should be kept at the centre, so that everybody in the United Kingdom has the same pensions, benefits, and so on, and to what extent can those be differentiated inside different parts of the UK. So, if we had an end goal, the end goal would be greater stability than Wales has had since 1997, when we've had different iterations of the Government Wales Act. That's rather different than Scotland. Scotland obviously has not been completely stable, but it's been much more stable than Wales. And I think we would like to have more stability, and I agree with the politicians who've said that people in Wales don't want endless discussions of constitutional matters, they want delivery of services. So what we would have liked to have happened is that the constitutional discussion could be put to bed and people should concentrate on the delivery of services. I'm still optimistic.
And as we've reached the end of talking about the end of devolution, that's also the end of the podcast. So thank you for listening.
This was Law Stories, written and produced by
Megan Talbot
and Linda Thompson,
with our special guest, Sir Paul Silk. If you want to receive future podcasts from us, you can subscribe on iTunes or leave us a review. It really does help new people to find us and for us to sort of publicize the podcast. So thank you for listening.
Bye.
Bye. And we thought we'd leave you with the final question we asked Sir Paul Silk, which was, is there anything that he feels that the public doesn't know that they really ought to know? So we will leave you with that.
Is there anything that you keep hearing from the general public that you wish they knew about, or that you would like to help clear up?
Well, lots of things
I can imagine there are lots.
I wish they knew about. I was here in Aberystwyth today. I've been here today because I had the honour of getting an honorary fellowship from the university, and one of the things you're asked to do is speak to the students, and I'm not quite sure what you're going to say, but I decided what I would say was to stick up a bit for politicians. Had a very bad press since MP's expenses scandal, since the way in which they exaggerated the truth, if you like, during the referendum campaign, the way the Labour Party and the Conservative Party have bickered since the election campaign, and the Chilcot report. It's all been a pretty perfect storm for politicians. But I've worked with politicians for most of my career, and most of them are decent people who want the best for the societies in which they live. Now, you and I will disagree about what is the best for the society in which they live, and if you approach them a very free market right-wing point of view, you'll have a different view from somebody who approaches them from a very left-wing point of view. But my impression, my knowledge of most politicians is those on the left and those on the right and those in the middle are there, most of them, for the benefit not of themselves but of the society in which they live. If there's one thing that I wish I could convince more people of, is that politicians are not as bad as they are made out to be.
I think I can say the same for lawyers, really.
Yes, I'm sure that's right. Yes, yes. Well, lawyers, estate agents, politicians.
Yes. Well, maybe estate agents are too far.
all a bad lot.
Yeah, you're right.
But I think that would be the one thing that the little bit of campaigning I did made me realise, and perhaps I should have realised this before, is how David Tristan wrote something about this recently, how political parties have neglected so many people talking to them about ways of addressing their real concerns. The way in which our elections work on the basis of a very small number of people in a small number of seats being targeted. And that meant that I think in this referendum, an awful lot of people weren't being talked to by the political parties that they should have been talked to and might have listened to, and might have influenced the way in which they made their decisions. And that is something that perhaps it'll be a lesson for people inside political parties for the future, if we have another referendum.
Yes. Okay, thank you very much. That's lovely.
Thank you.
So thank you for listening, and goodbye.